What does it mean when a man celebrated for his wisdom craves not merely the warmth of one woman nor the devotion of 10, but the possession of 1,000? What hunger festers in the human heart that makes even kings, those draped in gold and sanctified by myth, become prisoners of desire? These are not idle questions. They are the keys to understanding one of history's most unsettling contradictions. The reign of King Solomon, the man remembered for divine wisdom, yet cursed by insatiable lust. We have been told he was the chosen one, the son of David, the builder of the temple, the monarch who presided over Israel's golden age. But behind the radiant facade of piety and prosperity lay shadows darker than incense smoke drifting from the holy altar. There was another Solomon one, absent from sacred hymns and children's tales. Solomon, the collector of bodies, the hoarder of flesh, the lustful king who bound himself to 700 wives and 300 concubines. 1,000 women living ornaments, conscripted vessels of pleasure, filling palaces like trophies, their voices lost in the echoing silence of history. Do not imagine this as mere excess. This was decadence weaponized by power. For each woman represented not just beauty, but dominion. A princess taken from Egypt, a daughter stolen from Moab, a widow claimed from Tyre. They were symbols of conquest and instruments of politics, but also fodder for the appetite of one man. He turned alliances into marriages and marriages into prisons. What does fidelity mean to a ruler who could command the world to undress at a glance? What boundary could remain intact when even the sanctity of kinship bowed before his lust? And so we stand at the threshold of a world that should never have existed. A kingdom adorned with ivory and gold, but also drenched in whispered moans and muffled sobs. A palace that history paints in sunlight, though its chambers reeked of musk sweat and wine. The story you are about to hear is not of triumph or glory, but of appetite without restraint, of a hunger so vast it consumed not only the man, but the nation he ruled. For in Solomon we see the paradox of humanity sharpened into a blade. The man hailed as the wisest of all became also the most foolish in his surrender to lust. He reached for God's light with one hand and drowned in the mire of his own cravings with the other. So we must ask, where does wisdom end and madness begin? What becomes of morality when power itself renders it optional? And how does the pursuit of forbidden desire unravel even the strongest throne? These are the questions that guide us into the abyss of Solomon's secret kingdom, where holiness and depravity lay side by side in the same gilded bed. To understand Solomon's descent, we must first step into the dazzling theatre in which he performed a stage crafted from cedar gold and the trembling devotion of an entire people. His reign was no ordinary kingship. It was the zenith of Israel's history, a period when borders stretched wide, trade routes poured treasures into Jerusalem, and the name of Solomon inspired awe across empires. The city itself was his masterpiece. Imagine marble courtyards bathed in sunlight, fountains whispering in the heat of the day, and gardens heavy with pomegranates, figs, and exotic flowers brought from distant lands. Ivory palaces rose from the hills, their walls inlaid with gleaming metal, and their floors softened by imported rugs. From the heights of Jerusalem, the king could gaze upon a realm that seemed invincible, gilded by prosperity. But power is a suffocating perfume. Its sweetness intoxicates, its heaviness dulls the senses, and its constant presence erodes restraint. Solomon did not merely sit upon a throne, he embodied an institution, a fusion of monarch and God-ordained authority. Subjects bowed until their foreheads brushed stone. Servants obeyed his word as though it had thundered from Sinai itself. No act, no indulgence, no command was too absurd to be refused. Banquets stretched deep into the night. Roasted lamb perfumed with cinnamon, honeyed dates and spiced wine flowed in endless supply. Musicians plucked harps and lyres, while dancers swirled through the torchlit halls. Nobles jostled for his favour, their whispers drowned by the rhythms of revelry. And always women lingered at the edges of the spectacle, cloaked in silks adorned with jewels, their eyes veiled as though to mask the inevitability of their fate. Here lies the terrible irony within this splendour, virtue suffocated. When a man holds everything in his grasp, wealth, wisdom, reverence and dominion, what remains to resist temptation? The kingdom's grandeur became not merely a symbol of success, but a veil hiding beneath it the corruption already taking root. For behind every banquet's laughter, there were whispers of foreign rituals. Behind every polished corridor, there lingered the musk of uncountable couplings. The theatre of power, once a temple to prosperity, had begun to transform into a prison of indulgence. Yet no one dared speak it aloud. To question Solomon was to question the very will of God. And so the courtiers smiled, the priests remained silent, and the people offered sacrifices unaware that within the gilded chambers, morality itself was already beginning to decay. Thus the golden age was not merely golden, it was blinding. In the brilliance of Solomon's reign, shadows lengthened unseen. For where power becomes absolute desire, soon becomes ungovernable. And it is here within this intoxicating theatre of grandeur that the first seeds of perversion were sown. At first, the signs were subtle, imperceptible to those dazzled by wealth and blinded by loyalty. A whisper in the palace corridors, a rumour drifting from servant to servant, hushed the moment a guard's shadow passed. They spoke of the king's appetite, not for the sanctity of love, but for its endless multiplication. What began as diplomacy quickly turned into indulgence. In the early years of his reign, Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh, sealing an alliance with Egypt. To the public, it was a gesture of wisdom, a triumph of diplomacy. Yet, to those within the palace walls, it was the spark that would ignite a consuming fire. For one marriage was followed by another, then another, until the palace groaned under the weight of foreign brides. They came not only with dowries of gold and spices, but with idols of their gods, their perfumes heavy with the scent of strange altars. The gardens of Jerusalem filled with women from Moab, Ammon, Sidon, Hittite lands, each carrying with her the customs of distant nations, each adding fuel to the king's hunger. What had once been political prudence began to look like collection and obsession. The palace became a hive of competing whispers, a labyrinth of jealousy where women's laughter was edged with bitterness and their songs were laced with despair. At night, the air thickened with the perfume of 100 burning oils. The king's chamber doors shut against the world, but within the moans and sighs of women became as constant as the sound of wind over the hills. Courtiers pretended not to hear, but the servants knew. They saw the endless procession of perfumed bodies, the silks discarded upon marble floors, the wine spilled across pillows. They muttered among themselves that Solomon's wisdom, once a crown upon his brow, was slipping into the abyss of desire. And yet still this hunger was not enough. 1,000 fleeting moments of pleasure could not fill the emptiness growing in him. The more women he took, the less satisfaction he found. Whispers suggested he sought not only foreign brides, but women whose presence should have been forbidden, ties of blood stretched too thin, kinship twisted into lust. These murmurs were dangerous, rarely spoken aloud, yet they curled like smoke through the palace halls, staining the air. Thus, the seeds of perversion took root not in sudden scandal, but in gradual erosion. Power had opened the gates to indulgence, and indulgence demanded more. Each act, once shocking, became routine. Each boundary, once sacred, dissolved into irrelevance. By the time the people began to suspect the transformation was already complete, the king who had prayed for wisdom now prayed for nothing at all. He was slipping quietly, steadily, into a realm where morality was no longer recognized only appetite. The seeds were planted, and soon they would bear the most grotesque fruit. There comes a moment when whispers no longer suffice, when secrecy cannot contain the weight of desire. For Solomon, that moment arrived like a slow tide breaking its banks. The palace, already heavy with the perfume of countless brides, became a stage where the grotesque could no longer be concealed. Boundaries that once seemed inviolable kinship sanctity, even the laws of his God buckled beneath the pressure of insatiable hunger. The chronicles do not speak of it plainly, for scribes were bound by reverence. But between the lines, the silence is deafening. There are hints of unions that should never have been women tied by blood or by forbidden kinship summoned into the king's chambers, as though the very idea of incest was a trifle beneath his power. What was taboo for his people became indulgence for their ruler. If a woman was beautiful, she was taken. If she was forbidden, she was taken more urgently. Still for the forbidden sharpened the appetite. Nights within the palace grew darker, stranger. There were banquets where wine flowed until the torches guttered low, and the music of lyres gave way to the rhythm of flesh. Women paraded not as companions, but as offerings, each one trained to obey, to please, to surrender. Some were brought in from distant lands against their will, bodies treated as spoils of conquest. Others were coerced by the sheer gravity of royal command, stripped of choice the moment they were summoned. In those chambers, pleasure was no longer pleasure. It was conquest, disguised as intimacy. The courtiers turned their faces away, but they heard enough to shudder in silence. They saw Solomon emerge from his chambers with eyes dulled, his body bloated by indulgence, yet still driven to excess, as if trying to silence a gnawing void. They watched as foreign rituals seeped into the heart of Jerusalem, altars erected in secret sacrifices performed at night, the blending of lust with worship. Some whispered of orgies where gods of foreign lands were invoked through flesh. Their idols smeared with oils and sweat, as Solomon presided over spectacles unfit for daylight. What had begun as diplomacy had metastasized into grotesque theatre. The king, who had once judged wisely between two mothers, now lost himself among 1,000 women, his discernment drowned in perfume and wine. His court, once the envy of nations, had become a place where no boundary held meaning. For the first time, fear gripped the people. Not fear of armies or famine, but of their king himself, a man who had crossed the line where wisdom becomes madness and indulgence becomes desecration. What they asked in whispers would God do to a ruler who mocked his laws so brazenly? The answer they suspected would not be long in coming. Day after day, night after night, Solomon's existence became a grotesque parody of kingship. The palace, once an emblem of divine favor, transformed into a labyrinth of indulgence. Long corridors echoed not with the debates of wise men or the prayers of prophets, but with the murmured footsteps of concubines, summoned at whim, their anklets chiming like chains in the half-light. Each morning began not with counsel or judgment, but with recovery. The king awoke on silk sheets damp with spilled wine and perfumed sweat, his body sluggish, his mind heavy, as though weighed down by the very desires that once exhilarated him. He was surrounded by the debris of the night goblet's overturned garlands, wilted, laughter faded into hoarse silence. And still as the sun rose over Jerusalem, more women waited outside his chambers, each eager or compelled to please the man who owned them. This was his rhythm. Banquets blurred into revelries, revelries into orgies. The line between day and night dissolved, replaced by an endless cycle of intoxication. Musicians played until their fingers bled, dancers spun until they collapsed, and women were passed like cups of wine, their value measured not by love or dignity, but by novelty. Yet beneath the frenzy lay an unmistakable emptiness. For though Solomon was surrounded by flesh, he was alone. No single woman held his heart. No embrace softened his solitude. Surrounded by abundance, he was consumed by hunger. Surrounded by noise, he was deafened by silence. Each new conquest left him hollower than the last, as though every indulgence carved another cavity in his soul. Servants whispered that he often stared into the distance after the orgies had ended, his gaze fixed on nothing, his lips moving in silence, as if reciting fragments of prayers he no longer believed. Some said he muttered the names of the gods of his wives, a man so fractured he no longer knew which deity might hear him. Others believed he heard nothing at all, that he was a hollow shell drowning in pleasures that had long since lost their taste. The irony was bitter. The wisest king author of proverbs and songs had become enslaved by the most primal of urges. His writings once praised discipline, yet his body sagged under gluttony. He spoke of love, yet knew nothing of it. What he called wisdom was buried beneath the rubble of his own cravings. This was no longer a king ruling his people. This was a man ruled by his desires, his mind a prisoner, his soul a battlefield lost. And though the palace still shone in the sun, though the people still hailed his name, those closest to him could see the truth their king was rotting from within each indulgence, another worm in the core of his grandeur. No corruption remains hidden forever. Excess, like a disease, always finds a way to break the skin. For Solomon, the consequences of his unbridled appetite began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like cracks forming in the foundation of a mighty palace. But soon, those cracks widened, and the weight of his indulgence pressed down upon an entire kingdom. It began with the women themselves. 700 wives and 300 concubines, each carrying not only their bodies into the heart of Israel, but also their gods, their idols, their secret rites. The palace courtyards once reserved for songs of Yahweh grew cluttered with foreign altars. Fires burned to Chemosh incense curled toward Astarte. Sacrifices were whispered to Molech. Within the very walls of Jerusalem, strange chants mingled with moans of pleasure as lust and idolatry entwined. What was once the holy city now reeked of foreign smoke. Prophets spoke out in hushed warnings, but their voices carried little weight. Who could rebuke a king whose appetite devoured nations? Priests muttered prayers, yet even they turned their faces away, fearing reprisal. The people too began to murmur. They looked upon their ruler bloated, distracted, consumed, and wondered if the blessings of God still rested upon him. Whispers in the marketplace grew into suspicions, and suspicions hardened into resentment. Alliances too began to unravel. Marriages meant to secure peace brought division instead. Foreign wives clamored for favors, for shrines to their gods, for privileges that placed them above the daughters of Israel. Nobles grumbled at their diminished standing. Generals questioned the king's judgment. And neighbors who once respected Solomon's wisdom now sneered at his weakness. The empire, gilded and glorious, began to tremble at its edges. And then came the rumors of the king's health. Servants spoke of nights when Solomon did not rise from his bed, when the wine turned bitter in his stomach, when women left his chamber in silence, unsummoned. Some whispered of disease, a sickness born of too many indulgences, spreading through his body as surely as corruption spread through his kingdom. Others claimed it was madness that he muttered to himself in empty rooms, bargaining with gods both foreign and forgotten. But whether it was sickness of flesh or sickness of soul, the truth could not be hidden. Solomon was no longer invincible. His power, though still vast, was crumbling beneath the weight of his excess. His pleasures had not only enslaved him, but imperiled the nation he was meant to shepherd. The people began to ask the question they once would not dare. Had their king, the wisest of all men, become the greatest of fools? And if so, what wrath might fall upon them all for his sins. The silence of heaven grew heavy, as though even God himself was preparing a reckoning. The slow corrosion of Solomon's soul soon bled into the body of his kingdom. The cracks that had once seemed hairline now spread wide, and into them poured rebellion, betrayal, and decay. For even the greatest monarch cannot hold an empire together when he himself has become its weakest stone. The first signs of collapse appeared in his own household. The wives' once silent ornaments now wielded influence sharper than blades. They whispered in his ear, each demanding shrines for their gods, each feeding his paranoia that another wife might steal his affection or usurp her place. The palace, instead of being a seat of order, became a nest of rivalries, where 1,000 women schemed and quarrelled, their jealousies dripping into the king's already fractured mind. Solomon withdrew. Once he walked among his people, settling disputes with wisdom so profound it was said to come from God himself. Now he remained cloistered in his chambers, venturing out only for hollow displays of grandeur. His counselors found him distracted, muttering to himself his once sharp judgments dulled by indulgence and suspicion. Some claimed he stared for hours into polished bronze mirrors, as if searching for a man long vanished from his own reflection. The nation followed suit. Dissent grew in the outer provinces, where governors resented the taxes demanded to fund Solomon's decadence. Labourers groaned under the burden of endless building projects, palaces for his wives, temples for foreign gods. Among them rose voices of rebellion, most dangerously from Jeroboam, a servant who would become a rival. The Golden Kingdom began to split along invisible seams, its unity dissolving beneath the weight of one man's insatiable desires. Paranoia settled over Solomon like a cloak. He no longer trusted his court, no longer trusted his generals, no longer trusted even his sons. Shadows lengthened in his imagination, every whisper a plot, every silence a conspiracy. The king, who once held all in the palm of his hand, now trembled that everything might slip away. Servants spoke of nights when he wandered the palace torch in hand, peering into corners as though enemies might crawl from the walls themselves. They said he recoiled from his wives, fearful that the very women he had gathered might poison him, that their kisses might conceal daggers. He ate little, drank much, and slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of judgment. The once mighty Solomon, who had presided over Israel's golden age, now seemed more ghost than king, bloated with pleasure, shriveled by fear, gnawed hollow by the consequences of his lust. To some, he inspired disgust. To others, pity. For there was tragedy in watching the wisest of men stumble blindly into ruin, undone not by enemies at his gates, but by the demons of his own making. Thus, the stage was set for the final act. The throne still gleamed, but the man upon it was already falling. His crown tarnished, his kingdom poised to fracture the moment his hand could no longer clutch it. The end came, not with a blade, nor with an enemy's triumph, but with a slow, ignoble collapse, the most fitting fate for a king, undone by his own appetites. Solomon's death was not the heroic fall of a warrior on the battlefield, but the quiet suffocation of a man drowning in the very pleasures he once commanded. By the time his final days arrived, the king was scarcely recognizable. His body, once vigorous, sagged beneath the burden of indulgence. His skin, yellowed and sallow, carried the pallor of too much wine and too little restraint. The wisdom that had once shone in his eyes had dulled into a weary glaze, clouded by paranoia and regret. He no longer presided over councils. He no longer visited the temple he himself had built. Instead, he lingered in shadowed chambers, surrounded not by prophets or priests, but by the fading perfume of wives who had long since ceased to care for him, except as a source of privilege. Servants whispered that he often muttered in his sleep, crying out to gods, both foreign and forgotten, pleading for mercy that never came. At times they claimed he spoke to no one, reciting verses of his own proverbs as if desperate to remind himself of the man he once was. But the words rang hollow, echoing like prayers spoken to an empty sky. And then, at last, his body began to fail him. The excesses that had defined his rain orgies, of flesh rivers, of wine nights without end, had left him brittle, weakened prey to lingering sickness. Some whispered that venereal disease ravaged him, that sores marked his flesh beneath royal robes. Others believed madness had consumed him, that his mind fractured under the weight of 1,000 sins. Whatever the cause, the truth was undeniable. Solomon the Great, the wise, the lustful, was crumbling. In the end, his death was as much a spectacle as his life. The wives, hundreds of them, gathered not in mourning, but in anxious silence, uncertain of what future awaited them when the man who bound them together was gone. Concubines wept not from grief, but from fear, knowing they would soon be scattered, discarded like broken toys. The palace halls, once vibrating with music and moans, fell eerily quiet as the king's breath grew thin. When it was over, there was no thunder, no divine proclamation, only a final rasping exhale, a body sinking into silks stained by years of decadence. The wisest king in history died not as a beacon of righteousness, but as a relic of excess, a monument to the ruin that unchecked desire brings. His passing shocked no one, yet it horrified all who had witnessed his decline. For in that moment the irony was complete. Solomon, who had ruled with wisdom unmatched, had been slain not by enemies, but by himself. When the breath finally left Solomon's body, the palace did not erupt in mourning. Instead, it sank into a silence so deep it seemed unnatural, as though the very stones withheld their echoes. For decades, the halls had pulsed with noise, music, laughter, jealous quarrels, drunken cries, the endless footsteps of women summoned to and dismissed from the king's chambers. Now, in the sudden absence of it all, the emptiness pressed upon every ear like a suffocating weight. The wives, 700 of them, stood arrayed like statues, their jeweled faces expressionless. The concubines gathered in clusters, whispering anxiously, their voices brittle like glass about to break. Few shed tears, for their grief was not for the man himself, but for what his death meant, their futures uncertain, their fates now dependent on shifting politics. They had been gathered for one man's lust. With him gone, they were little more than remnants of his appetite. The courtiers too felt the silence as both relief and terror. Relief because the king's madness had at last ended his paranoia, no longer casting shadows over every council chamber. Terror because the kingdom he left behind was fragile, its unity splintered by years of indulgence, its people restless and resentful. The once golden empire now trembled on the brink of division, and everyone knew it. Outside the palace, the people murmured with a mixture of pity and scorn. Some recalled the glory of Solomon's early years, the wise judgments, the grand temple, the wealth that poured into Jerusalem. Others remembered only his excess, his foreign gods, his insatiable lust. To them, his death felt less like tragedy and more like deliverance, as though a heavy weight had finally been lifted from their necks. But within the palace walls, the silence remained the most haunting. Rooms that had once smelled of wine and musk now reeked of stale incense and dust. The vast harem, once a marketplace of pleasure, became a mausoleum of forgotten women. No music played, no laughter rang out, no torches burned late into the night. The air itself seemed to mourn not for the man, but for the obscene spectacle that had ended with him. And in that silence lay the deepest horror. For the excesses that once shocked and disgusted had at least been alive, pulsing with sound and movement. Now, with their cessation, the absence felt even more unnatural. It was as though the kingdom had been drained of vitality, leaving only a hollow shell. The people of Israel awoke each day, knowing that something had shifted forever. Their king was gone, but the void he left was not peace. It was unease, a silence that lingered like the pause between lightning and thunder, promising that the true reckoning was yet to come. Death did not end Solomon's story. It only deepened the riddle of his existence, leaving behind echoes that refused to fade. For the kingdom he left was not whole, but fractured. The golden age of Israel, built by the wisdom of his youth, was undone by the decadence of his maturity. No sooner had the crown passed to his son, Rehoboam, than rebellion erupted, tearing the realm in two. The united kingdom of David and Solomon shattered into rival thrones, a legacy of division born from the lusts that had poisoned the palace. Whispers of his excesses endured long after his body was entombed. The harem of 1,000 women became legend spoken with both awe and disgust. Some called it proof of divine favor, that only a man blessed beyond measure could command so many. Others saw it as evidence of a curse, that no man could sink so low without divine punishment following close behind. Foreign chroniclers painted him as a tyrant of flesh, while his own people remembered him with unease, torn between pride in his glory and shame in his downfall. Even Scripture itself could not reconcile him. In one breath, Solomon is praised as the wisest of kings, the beloved of God, the architect of the Holy Temple. In the next, he is condemned as an idolater, a slave to luster man who betrayed the covenant for the sake of his wives' strange gods. His name became both blessing and warning proof that wisdom without restraint is no salvation at all. The ruins of his choices lingered in every corner of the land. Shrines to foreign deities stood where once only Yahweh was worshipped. Taxes imposed to feed his indulgences had broken the backs of laborers, their bitterness simmering into rebellion. And the women he had gathered, thousands of them, vanished into silence. Their lives erased, their suffering remembered only as footnotes to a king's appetite. But perhaps the most haunting echo was not political nor historical, but human. For Solomon's story is not merely that of a king, it is the story of desire unshackled of appetite mistaken for fulfillment. It is a parable written in flesh and blood that even the wisest of men can become the most foolish when they mistake possession for love, indulgence for meaning, lust for immortality. And so the question lingers, one that history cannot silence: if the man who possessed everything, wisdom, wealth, women beyond counting, still died hollow and alone, what chance have the rest of us? What is the true nature of power if it can exalt a man to heaven in one breath and plunge him into the abyss of his own cravings in the next? These are the echoes of Solomon, the lustful king, echoes that reverberate across centuries, haunting us, still a reminder that the most horrifying excesses are not born of weakness, but of strength left unchecked.